The words hit the crowd like a gunshot on a quiet Sunday morning. Cornelius Cooper stood in the center of Dusty Creek's Main Street, his boots planted wide in the dry earth, his jaw set like iron, and his dark eyes blazing with something that made even the boldest men in town take a step backward. Sweat beaded at his temples beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, and the late afternoon sun carved harsh lines across the planes of his face. His fists were clenched at his sides, not in the threatening way of a man looking for a fight, but in the desperate way of a man holding himself back from one. The crowd had gathered the way crowds always gathered in Dusty Creek, drawn by the scent of conflict the way buzzards circled a dying horse. There were merchants and ranchers, wives in calico dresses, old men who had nothing better to do than watch the world show its worst side, and a handful of men in the back whose eyes carried the particular gleam of cowardice, dressed up as authority. And standing on the opposite side of that crowd, with her chin lifted, and her hands trembling and her amber eyes burning with unshed tears she absolutely refused to let fall, was Dorothy Merritt. She was 31 years old. She wore a dark green work dress with the cuffs turned back because she had been in the middle of inventory when the mob had come to her door. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins on one side. There was flour dust on her left sleeve from the morning's work. She was the most dignified person on that street, and she was also the most alone. Because the men around her, the men she had sold goods to and extended credit to and stayed up by lamplight balancing ledgers for, were standing in a half-circle around her shop with their arms crossed and their faces hard and a petition in Alderman Graves's fat hands that would strip her business license from her if she did not produce proof of a male business partner within 30 days. The betrayal was staggering. The trap was perfect, and it had a name: Gerald Finch. Cornelius had heard the whispers when he rode into town that morning for supplies, and those whispers had ignited something in his chest that he could not contain and did not try to. He had turned his horse around, tied it outside the general store, and walked into the middle of that crowd with nothing but the truth and the burning conviction that what was happening was wrong down to its bones. "She built that business alone," he said again, his voice cutting clean through the noise and the heat and the collective cowardice of Dusty Creek. "She built it from nothing. She came to this town with $40 and a wagon load of dry goods, and she built every shelf and painted every sign and kept every promise she ever made to every single one of you. And she deserves your respect." The silence that followed was the kind that either breaks into something better or something far, far worse. This is where the story truly begins. 6 years earlier, Dusty Creek had been a different kind of place. Not better necessarily, but rawer, more honest about what it was. In 1876, the town was barely 15 years old, clinging to the edge of the Kansas prairie like a seedling that had not yet decided whether to live or die. The cattle trade kept it breathing. The railroad spur 3 miles east kept it dreaming. And the people who settled there were the kind who had come from somewhere harder and were trying to make something new, which meant they understood, at least in those early years, what it meant to start from nothing. Dorothy Merritt arrived in April of that year with her wagon, her $40, and a grief she wore like a second skin. She had come from Missouri, from a farm that had been in her family for 2 generations, and she had watched it burn in the final years of the guerrilla violence that had never quite ended with the war. Her father had died of a fever the following winter. Her mother had died the winter after that. Her brother had gone west and sent one letter and then gone silent. She was 25 years old, she had a wagon, she had $40, and she had a mind that worked with the precision of a fine clock and the determination of a woman who understood that the world was not going to give her anything and had made her peace with that. She chose Dusty Creek because of the railroad spur. She chose the dry goods business because the nearest competitor was 11 miles away in Caldwell, and the people of Dusty Creek were tired of making that ride. She chose a building on the east end of Main Street because the rent was cheap and the light was good, and the previous tenant had left behind a solid oak counter that she would never in 100 years have been able to afford on her own. She named it Merritt General Supply. She painted the sign herself. The first 6 months were brutal. She slept in the back room on a cot. She ate beans and hardtack 4 days a week to make the money stretch. She drove the wagon to Caldwell herself every 2 weeks to restock, leaving at 4 in the morning and arriving back after dark, her shoulders aching and her hands blistered, and her mind already calculating what she would need for the following run. She extended credit to farmers who could not pay until harvest. She ordered specialty items for customers who asked, absorbing the cost when those items did not sell. She learned every family's name. She remembered who had children with birthdays coming and set aside a peppermint stick with a piece of brown paper tied around it. By the end of the first year, she was not just surviving. She was building something. By the end of the second year, Merritt General Supply was the heartbeat of Dusty Creek commerce. She had hired 2 part-time assistants, a widow named Clara Hutchins who had 4 children and needed the income, and a 17-year-old boy named Tommy Reeves who wanted to save money for a land claim of his own. She had expanded her stock to include hardware, fabric, patent medicines, and a small selection of books that she ordered from a supplier in Kansas City. She had replaced the cot in the back room with a proper bed and rented the small house behind the livery stable. She was proud of what she had built, and she was careful about it. Careful in the way that a woman in 1878 had to be careful, meaning she knew that everything she had built was built on ground that the law did not particularly feel obligated to protect for her. She filed her business license correctly. She paid her taxes on time. She kept immaculate records in a ledger that would have impressed any accountant in Kansas City. She did not take on partners, not because she was proud, but because she had seen what happened to women who took on partners, and then watched those partners slowly absorb everything they had built until the woman's name was gone from the door. She was careful, and for 4 years she was safe. Gerald Finch came to Dusty Creek in the summer of 1879. He came with money and a smile and a story about cattle investments in Texas, and the men of Dusty Creek took to him immediately in the way that men of a certain type always take to another man of that same type. He bought rounds at the saloon. He shook hands with the right firmness. He wore a suit that had been pressed by someone who knew what they were doing, and he had a way of looking at you when you talked that made you feel you were the most important person in the room. Dorothy noticed him the way she noticed all new arrivals, which is to say, she assessed him with the same clear-eyed practicality she applied to everything. She thought he was charming. She thought he was possibly dangerous. She sold him 3 months' worth of provisions for his claimed ranch operation outside of town, extended him credit because the men who vouched for him were men she had reason to trust, and filed the transaction in her ledger with the same meticulous care she gave to every entry. She did not like him. She could not have explained why, not in the beginning. It was a feeling in the back of her throat, like the smell of weather coming in. By autumn of 1879, Finch had found a way to insert himself into the commercial fabric of Dusty Creek with the subtlety of a weed. He had invested in the saloon. He had struck a deal with the freighting company that ran supplies from Caldwell. He had made friends with Alderman Graves, who was a weak man with ambitions that exceeded his character, and he had quietly begun suggesting to certain people in town that it was irregular for a woman to operate a business of Dorothy's scale without a male partner. He said it gently at first. He said it the way men of his kind always start, as a concern, as a worry, as a reasonable thing that reasonable people might consider. He cited no law. He cited custom. He cited the comfort of the community. He cited the idea that some things simply worked better a certain way. What he did not say out loud, but what Dorothy understood with cold clarity by the first week of November 1879, was that Gerald Finch wanted her building. He wanted her client base. He wanted the supplier relationship she had spent 4 years building. He wanted everything she had made, and he had decided that the cleanest way to take it was to use the particular vulnerability of her situation as a woman in a frontier town, where the law was whatever the loudest men decided it was. The hidden motive was exposed in her mind like a struck match in a dark room. She doubled down on her defenses. She paid her license fee 3 months early. She made sure every account was current. She hired a second full-time assistant, a young man named Preston who was also, incidentally, the sheriff's nephew, a calculated move of social fortification. She wrote letters to 3 lawyers in Caldwell and 1 in Kansas City, asking about her legal protections, and received answers ranging from vague to deeply discouraging. She did not panic, but she did not sleep as well as she had. Cornelius Cooper had been running cattle in the region since 1874. He was 33 years old, born in Tennessee, raised between there and Missouri, and shaped by a life spent largely outdoors doing hard physical work that had made him lean and strong and quiet in the way that men become quiet when they spend more time with cattle and sky than with other people. He was not a large man by frontier standards, but he had a kind of contained physical presence that people noticed, a steadiness, an economy of movement that suggested he never did anything without thinking it through first. He ran a modest cattle operation 12 miles northeast of Dusty Creek, 300 head on a good year, a small crew of 4 men, a foreman named Abel who had been with him since Texas, and a reputation throughout the county as a man who was scrupulously honest, deeply fair, and completely immovable once he had decided something was right. He had first come into Merritt General Supply in the spring of 1877, a year after Dorothy opened. He had needed saddlery supplies and a particular weight of rope that the hardware store did not carry, and someone had told him that the woman at the general supply kept a good stock of working materials. He had walked in expecting to find a shop that primarily sold domestic goods and household items, and had instead found a tidy, well-organized operation that stocked exactly what he needed and several things he had not expected to find outside of Caldwell. Dorothy had been behind the counter doing accounts. She had looked up, assessed him in the same quick, practical way she assessed everyone, and asked what he needed without preamble or performance. He had appreciated that enormously. He came back 2 weeks later for more rope. He came back the week after that for salt and coffee. He started making Merritt General Supply his primary supplier, which meant he was in town more often, which meant he began to notice things. He noticed how she managed her assistants, with fairness and clear expectations. He noticed how she handled difficult customers, with a patience that never became weakness. He noticed the way she stayed after closing to organize her inventory with a lantern burning in the window, and the way she was always the first person on Main Street in the morning. He noticed the way she laughed when something genuinely struck her as funny, a sudden, unguarded sound that seemed to surprise even her, as if she had not expected joy to show up in that particular moment. He told himself he was not watching her. Men told themselves that kind of thing all the time. By 1878, they had developed a friendship built on the reliable architecture of commerce and mutual respect. He came in, she supplied him. They talked about weather and cattle prices and occasionally about books because she had started ordering titles he expressed interest in. He asked her opinion on things. She gave it directly, without hedging, which he found addictive. She asked his opinion on the practical realities of ranching, because she wanted to understand her customers, and he gave it honestly. Neither of them spoke about the feeling that moved underneath all of that like a river beneath ice. By the time Gerald Finch arrived in town and began his quiet campaign, Cornelius had known Dorothy Merritt for 2 years and had been in love with her for at least 18 months of that time. He had not said anything because the situation was complicated in ways that felt enormous. She was a business owner. She was fiercely independent. She had built something that was entirely her own, and he sensed with the instinct of a man who paid close attention that any approach from him that looked remotely like an attempt to absorb her life into his would end whatever they had built. He had watched men in town look at her with a kind of proprietary calculation that made his jaw tight, and he had watched her coolly and efficiently refuse every one of those approaches. He respected her too much to become one of those men, so he waited. He was not sure what he was waiting for exactly. An opening, a sign, enough courage, perhaps. He got none of those things. What he got instead was Gerald Finch. The first time Cornelius heard the whispers about Finch's campaign against Dorothy, he was in the saloon after a long drive, nursing a single whiskey and not paying much attention to the conversation around him. He caught the words business license and woman alone, and then Finch's name, and he set his glass down and began to pay very close attention. What he learned over the following weeks made the anger build in him slowly, the way a fire builds from coals, patient and thorough, and ultimately devastating. He learned that Finch had been cultivating Alderman Graves for months. He learned that Graves had drafted language for a town ordinance that would require sole proprietorships above a certain revenue threshold to register a male co-owner, language so carefully constructed that it would apply to exactly one business in Dusty Creek. He learned that 3 of the town's most prominent merchants had been persuaded, through Finch's combination of charm and implied financial pressure, to support the ordinance. He learned that Dorothy knew. He could see it in the slight tightening around her eyes when he came into the shop, in the way she was organizing and documenting with an intensity that suggested she was building a fortress out of paperwork. He wanted to say something. He came in 3 times in 1 week on pretexts so thin they were nearly transparent. He bought 2 different kinds of tobacco, and he did not even smoke. He stood at the counter and made conversation and watched her face and tried to find a way into the subject that would not feel like an invasion of the independence she guarded so completely. He was still trying when December came and the petition appeared. It was not the ordinance. Graves had been persuaded, apparently, that a formal ordinance might attract attention from the county seat. Instead, what materialized was a community petition, signed by 23 of Dusty Creek's merchants and prominent citizens, requesting that the town board review Dorothy's business license on the grounds that it had been issued, according to the petition's careful language, under incomplete disclosure of the proprietor's independent operating status, which was a tortured legal construction that meant exactly nothing but sounded, to men who did not look closely, like it might mean something. The petition was delivered to Dorothy on a Thursday morning in December by Alderman Graves himself, accompanied by Gerald Finch and 3 other men who stood behind Graves like they were making sure the door was covered. Dorothy read it in silence. She set it on the counter. She looked at Graves with an expression so controlled it was almost frightening. "You have 30 days to produce documentation of a business partner," Graves said. He was sweating despite the cold. "Or the board will be forced to suspend the license pending review." "What law authorizes this?" Dorothy asked. "It is a matter of community standards," Finch said smoothly before Graves could answer. He was smiling. He was always smiling. "We want to ensure that businesses operating at this scale are properly structured for the safety and confidence of the community." "Get out of my shop," Dorothy said. Her voice was so level, so completely without tremor, that Graves actually took a step backward. Finch did not move. He held her gaze for a long moment with something in his eyes that was not quite threat and not quite admiration but was entirely predatory. "30 days, Miss Merritt," he said, and turned and walked out. Dorothy stood behind that counter for a long time after the door closed. Clara Hutchins, who had witnessed the whole thing from the back room, came out slowly with her hands clasped together and her face white. "Dorothy," Clara said, "what are you going to do?" "I am going to finish the inventory," Dorothy said, "and then I am going to write more letters." But the letters, she already knew, were not going to be enough. The nearest federal court was in Topeka. The process of challenging a town board's licensing decision could take months or years, and during that time, Finch would find a way to move into the vacuum. He had the money to sustain a prolonged fight. She had the money to run her business, which was not the same thing. The trap was exquisitely designed. She had to admire. In the cold way she admired anything that was well made even when it was made against her, how thoroughly Finch had constructed it. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the table in her rented house with her ledger open and a lamp burning and worked through every possible avenue until the lamp oil ran low and the sky began to gray with morning. By morning, she had a plan. It was incomplete and it was risky, and it relied on things she could not fully control. But it was a plan. What she did not know, sitting in her small house with her ledger and her determination and her particular brand of solitary courage, was that Cornelius Cooper had ridden into town the previous afternoon for supplies, had heard the news about the petition within 20 minutes of tying up his horse, and had not slept either. He had spent the night in the room he kept at the boarding house when he was in town, and he had worked through every thought in his head with the same methodical thoroughness he applied to everything. He thought about the law. He thought about Finch's connections and his own. He thought about what he could do and what he should do and where the line was between helping and interfering, and what that distinction even meant when someone was being subjected to injustice this naked. He thought about Dorothy. He thought about her a great deal. By morning, he had made a decision, which for Cornelius Cooper meant that the decision was made and it would not be unmade. He was at the shop when she opened. She stopped when she saw him on the step and something moved behind her eyes before she controlled it. She looked tired. She had a leather folio under her arm which he recognized as the kind she used for important documents. "Cornelius," she said. "Dorothy." He took off his hat. "I heard." She looked at him for a long moment. The winter air was cold and still around them, and the street behind him was quiet, the town not yet fully awake. "Come in," she said finally. She told him everything. She did not edit it or soften it or frame it in any way that minimized the seriousness. She told him about the petition and the 30 days and Finch's motive and her assessment of her legal options and their limitations. She told him about the letters she had written and the responses she had received. She laid it out with the same precision she brought to her accounts, and when she was done, she looked at him with an expression that said she expected him to respond with the same honesty. He did. "There is one thing that would stop this immediately," he said. "If you take on a legitimate business partner, legally documented, real equity stake." "I know," she said. "I am not suggesting that as a solution," he said carefully. "I am identifying it as a path that exists. What I want to know is whether you have anyone in mind, family, a trusted associate." "My brother has not written in 4 years," she said. "I have no trusted associates who have the resources to be a credible partner." She paused. "I have been considering approaching the bank in Caldwell about some form of incorporation, but the process is slow and I am not certain it would satisfy the petition's language before the 30 days. "What is your plan?" he asked. She looked at the folio on the counter. "I am going to fight it publicly," she said. "I am going to write to the county newspaper and to every legal authority I can reach. I am going to document every transaction, every tax payment, every license fee. I am going to make sure that anyone looking at this business sees the record of what I have built and how I have built it. And I am going to show up at that board meeting in 30 days and I am going to stand in front of those men and I am going to make them do this to my face on the record in front of witnesses." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a good plan." "It may not be enough," she said. "No," he agreed. "It may not be." He left the shop 20 minutes later, and Dorothy watched him go with a feeling she could not entirely name. Something that lived between gratitude and longing, and a fear that if she let herself lean on anyone she would lose the balance she had worked so hard to maintain. Cornelius spent the next 3 days making his own preparations. He was not an impulsive man. Every action he took in those 3 days was deliberate and considered. He rode to 3 neighboring ranches and had conversations with men he had known for years, men whose opinions carried weight in the county, and who shared his particular distaste for the kind of commercial manipulation Finch was running. He sent a letter to his own lawyer in Caldwell. He talked to the county land registrar, a dry, efficient man named Howard Bledsoe who had been in his position for 12 years and who confirmed certain things Cornelius had suspected about the legal standing of Graves's petition. And he talked to people in Dusty Creek, quietly, one at a time, not campaigning, not pressing, just talking. He bought coffee at the diner and had conversations. He stopped men on the street who had signed that petition and talked to them plainly, without anger, about what they had actually signed and what it meant, and what it would mean for the town if a business like Merritt General Supply, a business that had served every one of them for 4 years with honesty and reliability, was destroyed by something this arbitrary and this self-interested. Some of those conversations went better than others. The ones that went worst were with the men who had the most to gain from Finch's success, the ones who had taken his money or expected his future favor. Those men looked at Cornelius with a mix of dismissal and discomfort and told him in various polite ways that it was not his business. He told them, in various polite ways, that they were wrong about that. The days passed. Dorothy worked. She worked with the focused intensity of a person who understood that industry was armor. She opened the shop early and closed it late. She handled every customer with the same steady competence she always had. She said nothing to anyone about the petition unless they brought it up, and when they did, she answered simply and factually and without visible emotion. Inside, she was afraid. She was afraid in the way that people are afraid when the thing they are afraid of losing is also the thing that defines everything about who they have become. Merritt General Supply was not just a business. It was the proof that she had survived. It was the monument to every early morning and late night and sacrifice and hard choice. If it was taken from her by Gerald Finch and his manufactured campaign, something in her would break in a way that she was not sure she could repair. She did not let herself think about that too long. She went back to work. On the 15th day, something unexpected happened. Clara Hutchins came in late that morning, which was unusual, and when she came in her eyes were red from crying and her hands were shaking. Dorothy put down what she was doing and brought her a cup of coffee and waited. Clara told her that Gerald Finch had approached her the previous evening at her house. He had been polite. He had been sympathetic. He had spoken about the difficulty of Clara's financial situation, about her 4 children, and the precariousness of depending on a business that might not survive the next 2 weeks. He had offered her a position, twice the pay she was making at Merritt General Supply. He had told her that the outcome was already decided, that Dorothy was going to lose her license, and that the kindest thing Clara could do for her own family was to accept the offer before the situation deteriorated further. "He said you were going to lose," Clara said. He was so certain, like he already knew. "He doesn't know," Dorothy said. Her voice was completely steady. "He is trying to dismantle what I have built piece by piece. He wants my staff gone before the board meeting so that the business looks weakened. He wants to make the outcome feel inevitable." She looked at Clara directly. "I cannot tell you what to do about your family. That is your decision, and it is a serious one. But I want you to know that I am not going to lose this without fighting with everything I have." Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She drank her coffee. Then she set the cup down and said, "I didn't take the offer. I told him I'd have to think on it, but I wanted you to know." "Thank you," Dorothy said, and she meant it in a way that went far deeper than the words. After Clara left to start the morning's work, Dorothy sat in the back room with her hands flat on the table and thought about Finch's certainty. He was certain because he had something she did not know about yet. That was the only explanation. There was a hidden motive, a back channel, something that had already been decided somewhere that she could not see. She needed to know what it was. She thought about who could find that out. She thought about her own resources, her own network, her own reach. And then, for the first time in years, she thought about asking for help not as a last resort but as a strategy. She closed the shop 20 minutes early that evening. She walked to the boarding house and asked the woman at the front desk if Mr. Cooper was in his room. He was not. He was in the dining room, eating supper alone with a newspaper folded on the table beside him. He looked up when she walked in, and she saw something shift in his eyes, something that was quickly controlled but not quickly enough. "May I sit?" she asked. "Please," he said, and folded the newspaper. She told him about Finch's visit to Clara. She told him about her suspicion that something was already decided in some channel she couldn't access. She asked him directly, without preamble, whether he had connections or information that might illuminate what that was. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I may have something. I've been looking into Finch's cattle investment claims. There are some inconsistencies." She leaned forward slightly. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "The ranch he claims to be developing outside of town has no registered brand with the county recorder," he said. "The Texas investors he cites by name don't appear in any of the Cattle Association records I have access to. And Bledsoe at the land office told me, carefully and off the record, that there may be questions about the financing of Finch's saloon investment." Dorothy was very still. "You think he has something to hide?" "I think he is in Dusty Creek not because he wants to build something here, but because he needs something from here," Cornelius said. "The question is what, and whether it connects to your business specifically or whether you are just the most convenient target." "What would my business give him that he couldn't get from buying a building somewhere else? Your client base, your supplier relationships, 4 years of trust that he cannot build from scratch." Cornelius looked at her steadily. "And possibly your building's location." She thought about that. "The railroad," she said slowly. "There's been talk about extending the spur into town proper. If that happens, the most valuable commercial real estate would be along the east side of Main Street." "Which is where your shop is," he said. The shape of it became clear in her mind like a picture emerging from a fog. Finch was not primarily after her business. He was after the land under it, or at least the established commercial presence on it, a leveraged position in anticipation of the railroad extension that was still a rumor but a persistent one. Her business license suspension would force her to either take on a partner of his choosing or close, which would open the building for sale under financial duress, which meant below market value, which meant Finch could acquire it cheaply, and then ride the railroad's arrival to a windfall. It was elegant. It was ruthless. And it was the kind of dark scheme that required either significant capital or significant debt to execute, which meant Finch was either very wealthy or very extended. "If he is extended," she said, "then he needs this to move fast. He cannot afford delays." "That would explain his certainty about the outcome," Cornelius said. "He needs it settled before the 30 days are up because he has commitments somewhere that depend on it." They sat with that for a moment. The dining room was quiet around them, the evening settling in. Someone had lit the stove in the corner and the warmth was soft and ordinary and at odds with the sharpness of what they were discussing. "I need evidence," she said, "not just inference." "I know," he said. "I've written to 2 men in Texas who might be able to verify his cattle claims. I'm waiting on the responses." "That could take too long." "It could," he agreed. "There's another avenue. Abel, my foreman, has a cousin who works for the Caldwell Freight Company, the one Finch made a deal with. If Finch's freight arrangements are part of a larger scheme, there might be documentation there." She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them made the shadows move slowly, and in that light, with the worry stripped away for just a moment by the focused clarity of planning together, she saw him very plainly. She saw the steadiness in him, the careful intelligence, the particular quality of his attention that made her feel, despite everything, that she was not alone in this. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. It came out more direct than she intended. He met her eyes without flinching. "Because it's the right thing," he said, "and because you matter." She held his gaze for a moment that stretched past comfortable and into something else entirely. Then she looked down at the table. "Thank you, Cornelius," she said quietly. He walked her back to her house that night. They did not talk about the case. They talked about other things, about the cattle market and a book she had just finished, and a story about his foreman Abel that made her laugh suddenly in the cold night air. That unguarded sound that he had noticed the very first time he heard it and had never stopped noticing. At her door she turned and looked at him, and he thought for one arrested moment that something was going to be said or done that would change things irrevocably. But she only said good night and went inside, and he stood in the cold, dark street for a long moment before turning and walking back toward the boarding house. He sent a message to Abel the following morning. Abel, whose full name was Abel Price, was a laconic, capable man of 40 who had been with Cornelius since their Texas years, and who understood his employer's character well enough to know that when Cornelius asked for something quietly, it mattered. Abel rode to Caldwell that same day and found his cousin, a man named James who worked the freight company's shipping dock, and over a long evening with a bottle of good whiskey, James told Abel things about Gerald Finch's freight arrangements that were very interesting indeed. Abel was back on the 18th day with a folded set of papers that James had provided, copies of shipping manifests and payment records that showed, among other things, that Finch had arranged for prepayment of 6 months of commercial freight capacity along the Dusty Creek route, starting from a date that corresponded precisely with the anticipated board meeting on Dorothy's license. He had planned for the outcome before the outcome had happened. Cornelius sat with those papers for an hour. Then he folded them into his coat and rode to town. Dorothy was in the shop when he arrived. She took one look at his face and sent Clara and Preston out on errands. He spread the papers on the counter. She read them twice, slowly, with the focused attention she gave to anything important. When she finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "This shows he planned for my failure," she said. "But it doesn't show what mechanism he used to ensure it." "No," Cornelius said, "but it shows intent, and it shows that he committed significant capital to an outcome before that outcome existed. If we put this in front of the right people before the board meeting, it changes the conversation." "Graves is already bought," she said. "The 3 merchants who are leading the signatures are Finch's people. Who is the right person?" "The county judge sits on the district circuit," Cornelius said. "He is in Caldwell next week. If we can get this information in front of him with a formal written complaint about the petition's legal basis, and I believe Bledsoe will support that complaint privately, we may be able to get the board meeting suspended pending county review." It was not a guaranteed solution. It was a wedge, a way to buy time and change the terrain, but it was something. "How do I get to Caldwell?" she said. "I can't close the shop. If I close now it looks like I'm retreating." "You don't go," he said. "I go, with your written authorization to present the complaint on your behalf." She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light fell through the front window and lay flat across the counter between them, and in that light she looked like a woman in a portrait, composed and fierce and exhausted and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with softness. "Cornelius," she said, "this is not your fight." "It became my fight," he said, "when I decided to care about what happened to you." The words fell between them like something solid. She looked away first, out the window at the street. When she looked back, something in her face had shifted. Something had come unguarded in a way that she immediately tried to put back but couldn't quite manage. "I'll write the authorization," she said. He rode to Caldwell the next morning. The legal process was not as swift as he had hoped. The judge's clerk told him the judge was occupied with a property dispute that would take 2 more days. Cornelius found a boarding house in Caldwell and stayed. He spent those 2 days talking to Bledsoe's counterpart in the county seat, and to the regional land registration office, and to a lawyer named Sylvia Graham, who had been admitted to the Kansas bar in 1876, and who specialized in property and commercial law, and who had a particular interest in cases involving frontier business regulations. Sylvia Graham read his documents and Dorothy's authorization, and then looked at him over her spectacles with the expression of a woman who had seen exactly this kind of thing before. "The petition is legally void," she said flatly. "There is no Kansas statute authorizing a local board to require a business partner based on the proprietor's sex. What Graves has done is attach made-up language to a real licensing review process and hope no one notices. The question is whether the judge will act on that before the 30 days expire." "Will he? I'll have it in front of him tomorrow morning," she said, "and I will argue it myself." Cornelius sat back in his chair and felt something in his chest unclench. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Finch will have heard about this within 24 hours. He has connections in Caldwell. He'll push for an accelerated board meeting." "Can he do that?" "Graves has the authority to call an emergency session," she said, "if he's pushed hard enough." Cornelius sent a message back to Dusty Creek with the fastest rider he could find. He addressed it to Dorothy, and it said simply, "Proceeding well, but be prepared for them to move quickly. Trust no one who comes with new offers." Dorothy received that note on the 20th day and read it twice, and then tucked it into the leather folio with the rest of her documents. She had been expecting acceleration. She had spent the previous 3 days methodically reaching out to every customer who had expressed support, not asking anything of them directly, but making sure they understood what was happening and why, and making sure they understood the implications for the town if Finch succeeded. Because this was not just about her. If Finch could take a woman's legitimate business away through a manufactured petition, he could do it to anyone. The next target might be the widow who ran the laundry, or the Chinese man who ran the restaurant on the east side and who already faced obstacles that made Dorothy's situation look almost comfortable by comparison. She talked to people. She talked to them as clearly and honestly as she always talked to everyone. 3 of the men who had signed the petition came to see her privately in those days. Each of them came alone, and each of them was visibly uncomfortable, and each of them said something that amounted to the same thing, that they had not fully understood what they were signing, that Finch had framed it differently, that they were sorry. She accepted their apologies with grace and without drama. She told each of them that the most useful thing they could do was say publicly what they had said to her privately. 2 of them said they would consider it. On the 22nd day, Graves called an emergency session. Cornelius was still in Caldwell when the message reached him. He had presented the complaint to the judge that morning, and Sylvia Graham had argued it brilliantly, and the judge had taken it under advisement and asked for 24 hours to review the relevant statutes. Cornelius needed that 24 hours. He needed the judge's ruling before the board met. He sent another message to Dorothy. "Filing is before the judge. Do not let them meet without this information in front of them. Delay if you can." The board meeting was called for the following morning. Dorothy slept 4 hours. She rose at 4, dressed carefully in her best dress, made herself tea, and sat at her table with her folio open and read every document she had, one more time until she knew them so well she could have recited them from memory. When she arrived at the town hall at 8 in the morning, there were already people in the street outside. Word had traveled, the way word always traveled in a small town, multiplied and distorted but carrying its essential truth. People knew something was happening. People came to watch. Alderman Graves was already inside with 3 other board members and Gerald Finch and Finch's lawyer, a man Dorothy had never seen before who had clearly been brought in from elsewhere and who wore the kind of suit that was meant to intimidate. Dorothy walked in alone. She set her folio on the table in front of her. She looked at Graves and at Finch and at Finch's lawyer without expression, and then she sat down and folded her hands and waited. The crowd filed in behind her. There were more people than she expected. There were farmers and merchants and wives and children too old to leave home, but too young to understand. There was Clara Hutchins in the back with her hands clasped together. There was Tommy Reeves, who had quit his job months ago to pursue his land claim but had come back for this. And there was an empty seat next to Dorothy at the front table, and that seat filled, 15 minutes into the proceedings, with the quiet opening of the side door and the appearance of Cornelius Cooper, who had ridden through the night after receiving the judge's ruling at 9 the previous evening. He had the ruling in his hand. He put it on the table in front of Dorothy without a word. She read it in 10 seconds. She looked up at him with something bright and overwhelming moving behind her eyes that she kept contained by sheer force of character. He nodded once. She stood up. She addressed the board with the ruling in her hand and Sylvia Graham's letter of legal summary, and the shipping manifests and payment records, and every document that collectively painted the picture of what Gerald Finch had done and why and what it meant. She spoke for 22 minutes without sitting down. She spoke clearly and precisely, without drama and without pleading, and she laid it out in front of those people the way you lay out evidence in a room with good light, where everyone can see it. Finch's lawyer objected 3 times. Cornelius responded to each objection with a point from Sylvia Graham's legal summary. Graves sweated visibly. The 3 other board members looked at each other and then at the ruling in Dorothy's hand and then at Finch, and what they saw in Finch's face in those moments was the thing that turned it. Graves called a recess. During the recess, there were conversations in corners that Dorothy was not part of but Cornelius was, and he stood in those conversations with the same calm, unambiguous authority he brought to everything. The board reconvened. Graves announced that in light of the county judge's ruling and the documentation presented, the petition was being withdrawn pending further review, and no action would be taken against the business license of Merritt General Supply. It was not a ringing vindication. It was the sound of men trying to retreat with some dignity intact, but it meant Dorothy's business license was safe. The trap had failed. The crowd was very quiet. And then it was not quiet at all, because people began to talk, and what they said covered the full spectrum from relief to embarrassment to anger, and Gerald Finch walked out of the town hall with his lawyer and his carefully constructed plan in ruins, and outside in the bright winter light, the town of Dusty Creek began to figure out how to feel about what had just happened. What happened next was not what Dorothy expected. It was Cornelius who stepped out into the street, into the middle of the crowd that had gathered outside the hall in the way crowds do when something important has occurred, and it was Cornelius who spoke. He was not a man who made speeches. The people standing in that street knew that about him. They had known him for years as a man of few but certain words, and when he stopped in the center of the street and stood there with his hat in his hand and spoke, people went quiet the way they went quiet for things that mattered. He said what he said. He said that Dorothy Merritt had built her business alone and that she deserved their respect. He said it clearly and directly, and with the particular weight of a man who had thought about it for a very long time and was absolutely certain of every word. He named what Finch had tried to do. He did not name the men who had signed the petition, but he let the silence where those names might have been do its own work. He said that a town that let a man like Finch do what Finch had tried to do was not worth the name of a community. And then he stopped. The street was so quiet Dorothy could hear her own heartbeat. A man in the back, one of the farmers who had signed the petition and then come to see her privately, said loudly, "She's right. We were wrong." That opened something up. Not everyone spoke. Not everyone agreed. But enough did that the shape of the moment changed, and when it changed, it was permanent in the way that towns are permanently shaped by the moments they choose. Dorothy stood on the step of the town hall and looked at Cornelius, who was standing in the dusty street with his hat in his hand and his dark eyes finding hers across the crowd. She had 100 things she wanted to say and no words for any of them. She had also, in that moment, the full and terrifying clarity of a woman who has been alone for so long that she has forgotten what it feels like to have someone stand in the middle of a street and say her name like it means something. Gerald Finch left Dusty Creek 4 days later. He left quietly, which surprised no one who had been paying attention. Sylvia Graham had sent a formal notification to the county recorder about the discrepancies in his land and business registrations, and there were conversations happening in Caldwell about his freight arrangements and his cattle claims that were making Dusty Creek an uncomfortable place to be. He loaded his things on a hired wagon before dawn on a Tuesday morning, and by the time the town was properly awake, he was gone. No one mourned him. Dorothy heard about his departure from Clara, who had heard it from the woman who ran the boarding house, and she stood in the back room of her shop with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands and felt the enormous weight of the previous month lift from her shoulders and become simply air. She had won. Her business was safe. Her ledger was intact. The shelves she had built and stocked and tended for 4 years were exactly where they always were, and her license was renewed without comment by a board that did not make eye contact with her during the brief and businesslike transaction. She should have felt triumphant. She did feel something like that. But underneath it was something else, something that had been growing slowly for a very long time, and that the events of the past month had brought very close to the surface, and she did not entirely know what to do with it. Cornelius came into the shop on the afternoon Finch left. He came, ostensibly, to buy coffee and a block of salt. Dorothy watched him navigate this pretense from behind the counter with something that was perilously close to amusement. "The salt is on the 3rd shelf," she said. "Same place it has been for 4 years." "I knew that," he said. "You have been standing in front of the 2nd shelf for 30 seconds, she said. He turned and looked at her, and the expression on his face was so utterly undefended, so stripped of the careful composure he usually wore, that her heart did something specific and irreversible in her chest. "I don't actually need the salt," he said. "I know," she said. "I came because I wanted to see that you were all right," he said. "And I wanted to say some things that I have been not saying for a very long time." The shop was empty. Clara and Preston had both gone to lunch. The winter light came through the front window in its flat, clear way and lit the dust motes in the air between them. "All right," Dorothy said. She set down the pencil she had been holding. "Say them." He came to the counter. He stood across from her with his hands flat on the old oak surface and looked at her with the steady directness that she had always found both comfortable and terrifying. "I have been in love with you since some time in the 2nd year we knew each other," he said. "I didn't say anything because I didn't want to be the kind of man who stands between a woman and what she has built. I have watched you work, and I have watched you fight, and I have watched what you made here from nothing, and I want you to know that it has never once made me think you needed anything from me. It has made me think, every day, that you are the most remarkable person I have ever known." Dorothy's hands were flat on the counter on her side. She was aware of her own breathing. "And I am asking," he said, "if there is any possibility that you might feel the same way. Not because I want anything to change about your life or your business or who you are, but because I am tired of pretending that I don't feel this every single time I walk through that door." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about everything she had told herself over the years about staying unattached, about the ways that attachment had cost she couldn't afford. She thought about the architecture of protection she had built around herself, and she thought about whether that architecture was still serving her or whether it had become its own kind of trap. She thought about a man who had ridden to Caldwell and stayed 2 days and come back through the night and stood in a street and said her name out loud. "Cornelius," she said. "I have been not saying things for a very long time too." He waited. "I am not good at this," she said. "I have been alone for so long that I am honestly not certain I remember how to let someone in. I am going to be difficult and independent, and I am going to want to do things myself even when I don't have to. And I am going to have days when I trust the ledger more than I trust my own feelings because the ledger has never let me down." "I know all of that," he said. "I am also," she said, and her voice was quieter now, "very much in love with you. I think I have been for a while, and I have been telling myself a great many useful stories about why that was impractical." The silence that followed was warm in a way that the preceding silence had not been. He reached across the counter and took her hand. She let him. They stood like that in the winter light of her shop, hands linked across the old oak counter, and it was not dramatic, and it was not loud, and it was not the way she had imagined things when she was a young woman in Missouri who still imagined things. It was better than that. It was real in the way that only things that have been carefully earned and honestly approached can be real. "I would like to take you to dinner," he said. She smiled. It was the unguarded kind. "Yes," she said, "you may take me to dinner." The following months were the kind that make up the real fabric of a love story. Not the crisis and the confrontation, but the ordinary hours that accumulate into something that holds. They took dinner together twice a week when he was in town, at the hotel dining room on Main Street, and the town watched this with the particular attention of a community that had just been through a significant moral reckoning and was paying closer attention to its own behavior as a result. Nobody said anything unkind. Several people said things that were warm and genuine. He brought her books from Caldwell. She told him with complete directness which ones she had already read and which ones she was interested in, and they developed a habit of discussing what she was reading over dinner in a way that he found endlessly stimulating, and she found, with some surprise, deeply comforting. She had not had a person to talk to about books since Missouri. She visited his ranch for the first time in March of 1880. He drove her out in his wagon on a clear Saturday morning, and she sat beside him on the bench and looked at the land and asked him questions about the cattle operation with the same focused practical intelligence she brought to her own business. He answered every question fully and without condescension, which she noted and appreciated. The ranch was modest and well-maintained, which told her everything she needed to know about his character. The house was small, well-built, with good south-facing windows, and clean in the way that a person is clean when neatness is a value rather than a performance. Abel Price met them at the barn and shook Dorothy's hand with a straightforwardness that made her like him immediately. She looked at the land and thought about what it would mean to be connected to it. She thought about this in the careful, honest way she thought about everything important. On the way back to town, with the late afternoon light turning the prairie grass gold, she said to him, "I am not going to close the shop." "I know," he said. "I am not going to become secondary to anything," she said. "Not to a marriage or a household or any expectation about what women do." "Dorothy," he said, with a patience that was not condescension but was instead the patience of a man who is entirely sure of what he believes, "I fell in love with you because of who you are. I would not ask you to become someone else. The shop is yours. It will always be yours." She looked at the road ahead of them for a moment. Then she said, "I am going to need you to be very patient with me." "I have been patient for 2 years," he said. "I have a great deal of practice." She laughed, the sudden, unguarded kind, and the sound of it moved across the open land around them, and he thought it was, without question, the best sound in the world. He proposed to her in May of 1880. He did not make a spectacle of it. He came to the shop after closing on a Friday evening when the last light was dying in the windows, and the street was quiet, and she was doing her weekly accounts. He waited until she looked up from the ledger. He said what he meant in simple, direct language, which was the only language either of them trusted anyway. He told her he wanted to marry her. He told her it was because she was the person he most wanted to spend his days with, and he could not imagine approaching the rest of his life without her in it. He told her that he had no expectation of changing anything about how she lived except that he hoped they would live it together. She closed the ledger. She looked at him for a long time. "Yes," she said. They were married in July of 1880 at the small church on the west side of Dusty Creek, on a Saturday morning so hot that the wildflowers Clara had gathered had wilted slightly by the ceremony time, and everybody laughed about it after. Clara was her matron of honor. Abel Price stood with Cornelius. There were perhaps 40 people there, which was almost everyone in Dusty Creek who was worth knowing, and the atmosphere was the warm, uncomplicated kind that comes when people who have earned their happiness arrive at it. Dorothy wore a dress she had made herself from ivory muslin she had ordered specifically for the occasion. She wore her hair pinned up with two carved tortoiseshell combs that had been her mother's. She walked herself down the aisle and did not ask anyone to give her away, because she had not been given and was not being given. She was choosing, which was a different thing entirely, and the small distinction mattered to her in a way she could not fully articulate but did not feel the need to. She was 30 years old. She was not young by frontier standards for a first marriage, and she did not care about that at all. Cornelius stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him with an expression that every person in that church understood, the raw and grateful look of a man who knows exactly what he is receiving. They said their vows plainly and meant every word. The first year of their marriage had the particular texture of two very independent people learning, with great care and occasional negotiation, how to share a life without losing themselves in it. They kept her house in town for the days when she needed to be close to the shop, and he drove in from the ranch when he could. And on the days when she drove out to the ranch after closing, they ate supper together with Abel and the hands on the long table outside the cookhouse and watched the stars come out over the prairie. They argued occasionally. They were both people with strong opinions and the stubbornness of those who have survived by their own determination, and sometimes those qualities met in a collision that required real honesty to resolve. But they argued in the way of people who respect each other even when they disagree, which meant the argument was always really a conversation, and the conversation always eventually arrived somewhere better than where it started. She expanded Merritt General Supply in the spring of 1881, adding a dedicated hardware section that she had been planning for 2 years, and a small postal agency that served the outlying farms and ranches, a service desperately needed and widely appreciated. She hired a third full-time assistant. The business was thriving in the way that solid businesses thrive, not spectacularly but steadily and deeply, with the kind of community trust that takes years to build and sustains through difficulty. The railroad extension came in the autumn of 1881. The east side of Main Street became, as the most perceptive people had anticipated, significantly more valuable. Dorothy had already extended her lease. She was not displaced. She was, in fact, positioned to serve the new traffic the railroad brought, which she did with characteristic efficiency. She thought about Gerald Finch occasionally, not with anger but with the cold satisfaction of knowing that his carefully constructed trap had closed around him instead of around her. In November of 1881, Dorothy discovered she was going to have a child. She sat with this information for 2 days before she told Cornelius, not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she needed to turn it over in her own mind first, to understand how she felt about it, which was a complicated and layered thing that included joy and terror, and a kind of profound disorientation. She told him on a Tuesday evening at the ranch after supper, sitting on the porch with the last of the autumn warmth in the air. She said it simply, as she said everything. He was very still for a moment. Then he turned and looked at her with an expression she had no word for. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am frightened," she said, "and very happy, in approximately equal measure." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, which was something she still sometimes had to practice giving herself permission to do, and they sat in the dark and listened to the cattle moving at the far edge of the pasture. "Everything will be all right," he said. "You don't know that," she said, with the honest practicality she couldn't turn off even in tender moments. "No," he agreed, "but I will be here for every part of it regardless." She turned and pressed her face against his shoulder for just a moment. "That is enough," she said. Their son was born in July of 1882 in the heat of summer at the house in town with a midwife named Harriet who had delivered half the children in the county. Cornelius was there the whole time, which was unusual enough that Harriet raised an eyebrow, but he was immovable on the subject and Dorothy had told him she wanted him there, which settled it. The labor was long and difficult and exhausting in the way that Harriet told them honestly it often was, and when it was over and the baby was placed in Dorothy's arms, She looked down at the red, indignant face of her son and felt something move through her that was wider than anything she had experienced before. "He has your eyes," Cornelius said, leaning over her with a face so open and undone that she felt her own eyes fill. "He has my father's nose," she said, and laughed through the tears. They named him Henry James Cooper, Henry for Cornelius's father, James for Dorothy's vanished brother, who she still hoped would appear one day with a letter and an explanation. Henry was a vigorous, opinionated child from his first weeks, which surprised no one who knew his parents. He slept poorly, ate enthusiastically, and demonstrated by the age of 3 months an absolute refusal to be put down when he wanted to be held, which Dorothy handled with a combination of maternal indulgence and pragmatic improvisation that included a carrying sling she fashioned from a length of soft cotton that allowed her to walk the shop floor with Henry strapped to her front. Clara Hutchins declared this absolutely sensible and efficient. The more conventional women of Dusty Creek were divided, and Dorothy paid their division approximately no attention. Cornelius came to town 4 and 5 days a week in those first months, leaving Abel in charge of the ranch with the confidence of a man whose foreman was entirely capable. He had built a larger room onto the house in town during the spring, anticipating the need, and he moved between the townhouse and the ranch with the practical flexibility that had always characterized his approach to life's arrangements. He was a good father in the undemonstrative, steady way that he was good at everything, present and patient and quietly devoted. He could quiet Henry in the middle of the night with a reliability that Dorothy found both impressive and somewhat smug about in the way of parents who discover unexpected competencies in each other. Life settled into its new shape, fuller and louder and more complex than before, and deeply, fundamentally good. In 1883, Cornelius expanded the ranch. He added 50 head and a new section of fencing along the north pasture, and a proper barn to replace the aging structure he had inherited with the property. He did it carefully, within his means, consulting Dorothy on the financial planning in a way that some men might have found odd, sharing his accounts with his wife as a matter of course, because she had a financial mind sharper than anyone he had ever met, and it would have been absurd not to use it. She reorganized his ranch accounts in 2 weeks in a way that identified 3 areas of unnecessary expenditure and 2 opportunities for better supplier pricing, and he thanked her for it and implemented every suggestion, and she tried not to be too visibly pleased with herself, which she mostly managed. Tommy Reeves, her former assistant, came back to Dusty Creek in 1883 with a wife and a land claim established, and a face weathered by 2 years of honest outdoor work. He came into the shop and shook Dorothy's hand and told her with genuine emotion that the wages she had paid him had funded the stake for his claim, and she told him she was glad of it and sold him 6 months of supplies at her best trade rate. It was the kind of thing that happened around Merritt General Supply, the way that small, genuine acts of decency compound over years into a legacy that a town actually feels. The winter of 1883 was harsh, one of those Kansas winters that comes down hard and stays. There was a period in January where snow fell for 6 days straight, and the roads into town became impassable for 2 weeks. Dorothy had anticipated this with the thoroughness she applied to everything, and had stocked the shop with 3 months of essential goods by November, which meant that, when the snow locked the town in, she was the only supply source available. She opened the shop every day. She extended credit to everyone who needed it. She sent supplies out to farms along routes she organized herself, using men with horses who could navigate the drifts, keeping a meticulous record of everything extended and trusting, with the confidence of long experience, that the community she had served for 7 years would settle its accounts when spring came. They did. Everyone. In the spring of 1884, she received a letter postmarked from New Mexico Territory. She recognized the handwriting before she fully processed where it was from, because it was a handwriting she had not seen in 5 years but had never forgotten. Her brother James was alive. He was well. He was working a silver claim outside of Santa Fe, and he was sorry, genuinely and wrenchingly sorry in the way of a person who has had too much time with their own silence to explain it. He wrote 4 pages, dense with apology and news and questions about her life, and she sat in the back room of her shop and read every word 3 times. She wrote back that evening 12 pages, which was more than she had written to anyone in years. She told him everything. The business and the petition and Finch and the fight and Cornelius and the wedding and Henry. She wrote it all the way she had lived it, without drama, but without softening the important parts. James wrote back 6 weeks later. He was coming. He did not know exactly when, but he was coming. He arrived in August of 1884, thinner than she remembered and sun-darkened, and with a scar along his jaw that he explained with a brief reference to a mining accident, and then declined to elaborate on. He walked into Merritt General Supply on a Tuesday afternoon, and Dorothy was behind the counter, and she looked up and saw her brother's face and put her hand over her mouth for a moment before she came around the counter and held him. He stayed for 2 weeks. He sat at Cornelius's table and ate at his ranch and held Henry on his knee and walked through every room of Dorothy's shop and shop house and ranch with the careful eyes of a man taking an inventory of a life he had been absent from and was trying to understand. On the last evening before he left, he sat with Dorothy on the porch of the ranch house while Cornelius was inside with Henry, and the purple dark came down over the prairie. "You built something real," he said. "Everything here. The shop, this life, it's real." "I know," she said. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," he said. "You're here now," she said. "That's not nothing." He left on a Wednesday morning. He was not disappearing this time. He had left an address. He wrote regularly after that, letters that came every 6 weeks or so, filling in the years of his absence piece by piece, and she wrote back with the same regularity, and it was not the same as having him there, but it was a thread, and threads held things together. Dorothy turned 34 in October of 1884. Cornelius brought her flowers from the prairie, and a book he had ordered from the Kansas City supplier 3 months in advance, because he had noticed her mention the title in passing once and remembered it. She received both gifts with the particular warmth of a woman who has learned to accept being known. Henry had just turned 2, and he ran through the house with the specific deranged energy of a 2-year-old, who had inherited the physical confidence of a cattleman and the dogged purpose of a woman who painted her own signs, and who was, by general agreement, the most exhausting and most beloved child in the county. Life in Dusty Creek had changed meaningfully in the years since the petition and Finch's departure. The town was larger, pulled by the railroad traffic, and new families arrived regularly, which brought new commerce and new complications. Dorothy had watched 3 new businesses open on Main Street, one of them run by a young woman named Ada Marsh, who had arrived from Ohio with a millinery business and a determined jaw, and Dorothy had extended her the same credit terms she had extended to everyone she considered a sound investment. Ada's shop thrived. Dorothy had expected it would. The county saw, in those years, the slow and often painful arrival of legal protections that made the ground a little more solid under the feet of women in business, incremental changes in Kansas territorial law and county ordinance that were the product of persistent advocacy by people across the state who had spent years making the same arguments Dorothy had made in that town hall. She followed these developments in the newspapers with a close and personal interest. She wrote a letter to the county commissioner in 1885 about a specific proposed change to business licensing requirements that she believed was both insufficient and a step in the right direction, and her letter was clear and well argued, and was included in the official record of the proceedings. Cornelius read it before she sent it, and said it was the best reasoned document on the subject he had seen, and he had read several. She appreciated the assessment and sent it anyway. Cornelius in those years was building the ranch toward something sustainable and lasting. He had 200 head now, reliable water access, a good relationship with the cattle buyers out of Wichita, and the kind of operational steadiness that allowed him to plan 3 years out rather than reacting to each season. He was content in his work in the way that people are content when the work matches their character. He was also, more than he had expected to be, a man who looked forward enormously to the end of each working day. Not because the work was hard, though it was, but because the end of the day brought him either home to Dorothy or to town where Dorothy was, and that particular daily anticipation had not diminished at all in the 5 years since they were married. If anything, it had deepened, which he thought about sometimes with a quiet amazement he did not entirely know how to express. He expressed it in the ways available to him. He was present. He listened. He remembered things. He showed up. In the spring of 1886, Dorothy told him she thought she might be expecting again. She was, which became clear within another few weeks. She was 35, which was not young for a pregnancy on the frontier, and both she and Harriet, the midwife, approached the process with appropriate practical care. Dorothy did not slow down in any way that was immediately visible from the outside, but she made adjustments and accepted help, and let Cornelius and Clara cover more of the shop's heavy work than she might have allowed before. The pregnancy was easier than the first. The birth, in December of 1886, was still difficult and long but less frightening than it had been with Henry, partly because they both knew more about what to expect and partly because Harriet was experienced, and calm, and Dorothy was by nature a person who moved through difficulty more steadily the second time. They had a daughter. She arrived on a cold December morning with dark hair and her father's eyes, and a voice that made clear she intended to be heard. Dorothy held her and looked at Cornelius over the baby's head with eyes so full of everything that words would have been inadequate. "Hello," she said softly to her daughter. "I have been waiting for you." They named her Ruth Eleanor Cooper, Ruth for Cornelius's grandmother. Eleanor for no one in particular, because it was the name Dorothy had always thought was beautiful, and she had earned the right to give her daughter any name she pleased. Henry, who was 4, received the news of Ruth's existence with the philosophical equanimity of a child who had been prepared carefully, and who was, in the end, more interested in the peppermint stick his father gave him as a celebration present than in the new baby. His enthusiasm for Ruth developed gradually, over weeks, into the particular fierce and somewhat smothering protectiveness of an older sibling who has decided that the new arrival is his person. Ruth was, from her earliest months, an easy baby in comparison to Henry. She slept long, nursed well, and regarded the world with a calm, observant gaze that made Dorothy feel she was being assessed and found acceptable, which was a sensation she recognized. "She is going to be trouble," Clara said affectionately, watching Ruth regard a new customer in the shop with this calm, measuring look. "All the best ones are," Dorothy said. 1887 was a full and good year. The shop was doing better than it ever had. Cornelius's cattle operation had its strongest year since he began it. Henry started at the small school that had been established in Dusty Creek 2 years earlier, and distinguished himself principally by his inability to sit still, and his entirely accurate opinions about which of his teachers were good at their jobs. Ruth learned to walk, and immediately applied that skill to the purpose of following her brother wherever he went. Dorothy and Cornelius had by then the deep specific intimacy of people who have shared a life through its difficult parts, and its ordinary parts, and its joyful parts, and emerged from all of it with an understanding of each other that was not the breathless, romantic certainty of the beginning, but was something richer and quieter and more sustaining. She still surprised him. She did it regularly, which he thought was one of the greatest gifts he had received in his life, the fact of being continuously surprised by a person he knew very well. She had opinions about everything, and she arrived at them through a process he found endlessly interesting. She made decisions quickly and usually correctly, and when she was wrong she was the first to say so, which was rarer than gold in his experience. She still caught him watching her sometimes, in the shop or at the ranch table or in the evening reading by the lamp. And when she caught him, she looked back with an expression that had taken him a long time to read, but that he now understood as a kind of profound, careful love, the kind that still marvels a little at its own existence. In 1888, James Merritt rode into Dusty Creek with a pack horse and a saddlebag full of Silver Claims paperwork, and a face that said he had spent enough time away from family. He had not written to announce his arrival. He simply appeared on a September morning in the doorway of Merritt General Supply. Dorothy looked up from her accounts. "I'm staying," he said. "If there's room." "There is always room," she said. James settled in Dusty Creek with a speed that suggested he had made the decision thoroughly before he arrived. He found a claim outside of town that looked promising for neither silver nor gold, but was good grazing land, which he converted with Cornelius's guidance into a modest cattle operation of his own. He was 40 years old and roughened by the years in New Mexico, but fundamentally himself, her brother, with their father's stubbornness and their mother's eyes, and having him nearby filled a space in Dorothy's life she had stopped noticing was empty. He and Cornelius took to each other with the uncomplicated directness of two men who operated on the same frequency of honesty and practical intelligence. They argued about cattle prices and fence lines, and weather patterns, and never about anything that mattered, because on the things that mattered they were invariably in agreement. James was good with Henry, who followed him around with the focused attention of a 5-year-old, who had just discovered that uncles were a fundamentally exciting category of person. The shop came to its 10th anniversary in April of 1886, which Dorothy marked by closing for one day, the first time she had voluntarily closed on a working day in 10 years, and taking her family and Clara and Abel and James out to the creek east of town for a picnic. There was cold chicken and good bread and dried apple pie that Clara had made and a great deal of lemonade, and Henry fell in the creek at least twice, and Ruth ate an extraordinary amount of pie for a person of her size, and the afternoon stretched out warm and easy over all of them. Dorothy sat with her boots off and her feet in the grass and watched her children and the people she loved, and felt something so complete that it pressed against the inside of her chest like a full breath. Cornelius sat beside her and handed her a glass of lemonade and did not say anything for a while. Then he said, 10 years. 10 years, she said. What does it feel like? She thought about it seriously because she always thought about things seriously. It feels like evidence, she said finally. Evidence that the choices I made were the right ones. He put his arm around her. She leaned into him the way she had learned to without reservation. All of them, he asked. She turned and looked at him with the clear, steady look that meant she was about to say exactly what she meant. Every single one, she said. Henry ran past them, soaking wet from the creek, trailing Ruth, who was trying to catch him and shouting in a language that was only partially English, and James was running after both of them with a look of half-alarmed delight, and Clara was laughing from the blanket where she sat, and Abel was turning the last pieces of chicken on the iron grate over the coals, and the creek moved past in the afternoon light with that particular sound of running water that carries everything and leaves everything behind. Dorothy looked at all of it and held it in her mind the way she had learned to hold things of value, carefully, completely, with full awareness of what it was. Merritt General Supply was still standing on the east side of Main Street. Her name was still on the sign, in the same painted letters she had put there herself in the spring of 1876, touched up twice but never changed. The shelves she had built were still level. The oak counter was still solid. The ledger was current and the accounts were sound. She had built it alone. And then she had built a life that held it, and she had allowed herself, with extraordinary difficulty and great eventual peace, to be loved. She had not lost herself. She had not compromised what she built. She had found, against all the careful arguments she had made to herself against it, that love when it was the right kind did not take from you. It extended you. It gave you more room to be exactly what you already were. Cornelius Cooper had told the town she built her business alone, and that she deserved their respect. He had said it once, in a dusty street in the winter of 1880, with his hat in his hand and his jaw set, and his dark eyes finding hers across the crowd. He had spent the rest of his life proving he meant it. Dorothy Merritt, whose name was now also Cooper but who kept Merritt on the sign because the sign was true, had spent the rest of her life letting herself believe in the specific miracle of a man who understood the difference between standing beside someone and standing in front of them. The prairie light went long and golden over the creek, over the children and the family and the easy afternoon, and the day was very good, and the days after it would also be good. And Dorothy Merritt Cooper knew this with the same certainty she had always brought to the things she had built with her own hands and her own will and her own extraordinary, enduring heart. In the years that followed, Dusty Creek grew and changed and brought new people and new complications, as towns do when they are alive. But Merritt General Supply remained what it had always been, the beating commercial heart of a community that had learned, through one winter of reckoning, what it owed the people who held it together. Dorothy served as the unofficial supplier and credit line, an occasional counselor to 3 more new businesses opened by women in the following decade: Ada Marsh's Millinery, and a seamstress named Maria Chen who had come from San Francisco with her husband and a remarkable skill with fabric, and a bookkeeper named Josephine Hale, who eventually formalized into the county's first female certified accountant. Dorothy did not advertise these acts of support. She simply extended the same decency she had always extended to anyone she believed was building something real. Cornelius expanded the ranch to 400 head by 1892, a solid, respected cattle operation that employed 6 men year-round, including Abel, who had been with him now for nearly 20 years and who showed no interest in going anywhere. James's adjacent operation had grown as well, and the 2 men ran shared fences along their boundary line in a practical arrangement that saved both of them money and labor. Henry Cooper, at 12, was the kind of child who made his parents simultaneously exhausted and proud. He had his mother's intellect and his father's stubbornness, and a confidence in his own opinions that was occasionally alarming and frequently correct. He wanted to run cattle. He spent every afternoon he could at the ranch, trailing his father and his uncle, and Abel with a focus that none of them could dismiss as childish enthusiasm, because it was clearly something deeper. Ruth Cooper, at 8, had decided she was going to be a doctor. She had told this to her parents with the calm certainty of a person who has made an irreversible decision, and neither Dorothy nor Cornelius had seen any reason to suggest otherwise. She was, by every observable measure, the kind of person who would find a way to do exactly what she decided to do. Dorothy continued to run the shop with the same meticulous excellence she had always brought to it. She had her rhythm now, a rhythm built of 10 years of practice that was so deeply hers it was almost physical, the particular feeling of a key in a familiar lock when she opened the door each morning, the exact weight of the ledger book, the sound the third shelf made when the boards settled in the cold. She was 40 years old in 1891, and she was, by every meaningful measure, exactly who she had always been building herself toward becoming. The dark past was truly past now, the loss and the fear and the long solitary years, not forgotten but metabolized into the strength and the clarity that had carried her through everything that had come after. She stood in her shop on a clear October morning in 1891, with the autumn light pouring through the front windows and her ledger open before her, and the sounds of the town outside moving in through the glass, and she felt the fullness of it, the specific, earned fullness of a life that had been fought for and built and chosen again every morning. The bell above the door rang. She looked up. Cornelius came in with his hat under his arm and flour dust on his sleeve from the breakfast biscuits he had made that morning because it was Saturday, and he always made biscuits on Saturday, which was one of the 100 ordinary and irreplaceable things she loved about him. "Clara sent me to tell you dinner will be ready at noon," he said. "I know dinner will be ready at noon," she said. "Dinner is always ready at noon on Saturday." "I know," he said. "I came for another reason." She looked at him over the ledger. He looked back at her with the look she knew, the one he had been giving her since a Tuesday afternoon 10 years ago when he had stood across this very counter with his hands flat on the oak surface and said the things he had been not saying. "Are you going to tell me what the other reason is?" she asked. He came around the counter, which he did not do often, the counter being her domain, and he came and stood beside her and looked at the open ledger and at the shelves and at the light coming in the windows and at her face. "I just wanted to see it," he said. "All of it. Everything you built." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the town moved in its ordinary Saturday morning way, and the autumn light was gold and clear, and her children were at home with Clara, and her brother was at his ranch a mile away, and everything she had ever wanted to protect was safe. "It's still here," she said. "It is," he said. "It always will be." She reached out and took his hand, the same way she had taken it across this counter more than 10 years ago, and held it with the certainty of a woman who had built everything around her from the ground up and knew exactly how to hold the things that mattered. "Come to dinner," she said. "Yes," he said. They closed the ledger and walked out into the October morning together, into the good and ordinary and thoroughly real life they had made from the particular combination of her courage and his faithfulness and the long, unlikely gift of each other. The sign above the door read Merritt General Supply, in dark red letters on white paint in Dorothy's own hand, exactly as it always had. The town went about its morning. The light was very good, and the story was, in all the ways that mattered, complete.